time to hate whatever I am doing. It's all too late.
Hello, everyone. This is our third video in the series, and today we will be talking about the topic of grief.
Yes, great. And why do we think that it's so important to talk about grief?
I believe that grief is pretty misunderstood, and most of us throughout different cultures around the world haven't spent a lot of time exploring what grief actually is, how we experience it, how our culture defines it, um, how to really work with it or identify it.
Mm,
It's just kind of like that experience that's in the background of every human life. Um, I I saw something the other day referencing grief, and it was talking about how difficult it is to understand something when it's based on the absence of a thing. And truly, that's what grief is about, the absence of something.
mm.
So I believe there's a major blind spot we all have around our own grief, what grief is, all of that.
Yeah, right. Does it, I mean, you're the psychologist here, so does it belong to the basic emotions?
It's not considered like one of the main emotions because grief is a really complex process, but
Mm,
it does contain the core emotions within it. So
okay.
that's another piece I think is quite complex about grief is when we say we're feeling grief, it's hard to know what emotions are actually in there, because grief can be sadness, grief can be anger, grief can be desperation, felt as desperation in the moment. Um, so it's like an emotional experience, but sort of like a umbrella term for a whole collection of emotional experiences or states.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Because I thought it belongs to, isn't there like a list of, these are considered like the basic emotions, and I think it's up to six, uh, like fear, joy, anger,
Mhm.
sadness. Yeah, well, in there it is sadness, right? So it's probably
Yeah.
in
Well, I
that
mean,
area.
I think grief is kind of woven through a lot of different emotional experiences that we might have as humans.
Mm,
And most of us don't realize that though. For instance, a lot of people might be like, oh, I feel depressed and, or I feel sad. And they're not recognizing, oh, I feel depressed or sad because I've missed out on these really important developmental processes or missed out on certain experiences in life, or I had a major loss in this way or this way. That's grief.
mm,
And depression can be a result of a grief experience that was not resolved or that's not properly supported or
mm,
understood. Um, or someone might say they're sad and feel this really extreme sadness and not understand why, and it's like, oh well, maybe you've got a complex bereavement process going or a complex grief, and there's traumatic grief, right? There's trauma connected to losses from earlier in your life, and you
mm,
feel really intense sadness around a current loss without realizing, oh, this isn't just about this. There's all this other grief that's not been resolved. Or you might be feeling a lot of sadness one day out of the blue, not
mm,
recognizing that it was triggered by even the potential of loss
mm,
based on past losses you've had in your life. And
mm,
again, grief I mean, as we progress, the ICD and the DSM, they're getting more, these diagnostic manuals are getting more nuanced in how they understand grief and how they create diagnoses or research people in order to create a diagnosis. So there is, as time has gone on, there's been more acknowledgement of grief as like a pathological process, or it could be pathological or clinical. I've got different ideas about that. Like I think pathologizing grief is a little tricky because we are all susceptible to grief. As being humans, like our existential experience involves loss
Yeah.
and not getting what we want
Yeah.
and having emotions about that. So pathologizing that gets a little tricky, but at the same time, it's also helpful because it helps us all begin to recognize that grief exists. Like it's a starting point for us to acknowledge the impact that grief is actually having on daily experiences in life.
Yeah, and I think there we are at the core of why it's important to talk about it, because it's so basic in every human being's life. So, I mean, basically, connected to the three most natural stages of biology, meaning being born, living, and dying. It is, of course, connected to the dying part, and uh, most importantly connected to the dying part. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can happen during living that you can also grieve about, right? But yeah. Or speaking of this, it's actually happening. Somebody dies when somebody else is living, in the living entity, the living human being then is confronted with the loss, and then there's where the grief's coming in. And considering it from this very basic perspective, it's actually ridiculous how little we talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe, I mean, to me, it was the main reason why I wanted to have this as an issue to talk about, because in my experience, it is even up to the point where people flat out avoid it. They
Yeah.
cannot go into this, and of course the issue that is connected to is death. So they cannot talk about death. And if you cannot talk about death, I mean, this is a thesis now, but if you cannot talk about death, how can you grieve if you cannot address the issue of death?
Both
So
metaphorically and literally. Yeah.
yeah,
Little deaths we experience all the time, as well
exactly. Yeah.
as death, physical death itself. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And then of course this all opens the door to pain, right?
Yeah.
So whenever there's pain involved, and man, this could this from this you could like go to the entire compensating strategies, and then all of a sudden you're at how modern capitalism works in terms of entertainment to distract you from all the pain. And oh yeah, so okay, this is the road we're not taking. Although I mean, it's really interesting. It's so, when you think about it, it's so interesting. And
Hmm.
at the same time, we could, of course, go into it from a certain perspective, meaning, yeah, maybe this whole media consumption, I mean, it can do something on the grief issue.
Mm.
I have to put this down because that's something that I didn't think about in beforehand. Um, but yeah. Let's go back to the question, like to the question what grief is, and I mean, I'm a little bit reluctant to come up with a definition because it's so manifold, but
Mhm.
what I find important to address is the aspect um, of behavior, of cultural institutions that are or have been established
Hmm.
and are no longer there. And this is one of the issues, for example, I thought about when I was writing my autobiography, because I was really confronted a lot with the matter of, okay, how did this whole confrontation with death, with losing my father in the first place when he committed suicide, and then
Hmm.
I noticed that I was really lost, and also I noticed, with hindsight, I have to admit though, that people are dealing with it very differently. So in other words, although it is such an important thing and it is so widely spread and everything, or maybe
Hmm.
because of this, it has a very, very individual characteristic to it, which
Hmm.
means everybody needs and has to find his or her own way of grieving. So,
Yeah.
for example, what happened was I noticed that I had the huge desire back in the days when I was 11,
Hmm.
um, that I thought, okay, cool. It's probably not the right word, but it felt to me like, yeah, good. Now the family's gonna kind of get together more closely. It's getting closer
Hmm.
now because,
Hmm.
we're literally now sitting at the table together and having a lunch, and now we can talk about it. And it didn't happen. It
Yeah.
did not happen. And I thought back then, what what's wrong with people that it didn't happen? And then in when I was in psychotherapy back like yeah, 15 years later, 16 years later, I not that I talked about this at the very beginning, so this is just where I began with therapy, so it
Hmm.
probably was even later.
Yeah.
I came across the fact that one of the therapists, I'm pretty sure, said like, yeah, because I mean, this was your desire, that was your need, but probably didn't meet anybody else's apparently. And yes, it didn't. Because first of all, my brother, when I talked about to him about this, when we were talking about it, which didn't happen often, of course, which was also years later, he said he didn't want to do it. He did not
Hmm.
want to talk about it. Okay, 2.5 years my junior, so means probably his it could be that his reaction was more like just push it away and let's go ahead
Hmm.
with my life.
Hmm.
But there is this one incident that's also in the book, which I can still see it in front of me. We were gathering for lunch.
Yeah.
That's why I started with this example, like everybody's coming together and we're comforting each other, so to say. And we
Hmm.
were waiting for our grandfather. Waiting, waiting. Where was he? Well, it turned out my brother then went to the basement and found him there crying by himself.
Oh.
So he needed this absolute isolation, so to say, or security or distance to other people
Hmm.
um, in order to let the emotions go. That was
Yeah.
his need, right? That was
Yeah.
his need. And then when he came back, he was like snapping back into his role that has been assigned to him in order to get the
Hmm.
family through somehow.
Yeah.
And 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 I was, of course, I mean, as an 11-year-old, I was overwhelmed probably by this in terms of what do you do with a 72-year-old grandfather, who just like went to the basement, literally crying, and
Yeah.
and yeah, so there you have already like three versions of what people needed. I needed
Yeah.
comfort, I needed connection, I needed to have it on the table with everybody else. My brother didn't want it, and my grandfather needed distance. So, and my
Yeah.
mother, I cannot say anything about my mother because I mean she probably was already venturing onto the trail of becoming a psychosis. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing how each of us has our own personal history that contributes to what we call in attachment theory, our internal working model. And in this model, we learn what it is to be a human and to have different emotional experiences. And when it's safe to have them with people where we need to experience it separate from people. And then we also, in our internal working model, there's certain emotions that we just won't even have, right? Like we're not even aware of having them. We shut them down because it's just not even safe to feel them or acknowledge them. And, we're all walking around with this internal working model as how to live as a human, how to deal with these existential experiences like grief, loss.
Yeah.
And then you add on to it the cultural layer too, where I'm pretty sure that in German society and
Yeah.
culture that there's certain rituals you all do about how to grieve properly, right? Like the behavioral ritual, at least, right? The external rituals. And that it's supposed to create an environment where you can feel safe enough together as a community to grieve, right? But even so, with our internal working model, we tend to accept or only elements of the cultural model, and we don't even fully engage in that actually helping us grieve, right? And it's what's sad though is that most cultures these days aren't even teaching people how to grieve properly, right? Like you've got all these rites and rituals, and I mean we're even losing those. But
Yeah.
the common thing about having like a funeral or a wake,
Yeah.
in a lot of societies, there's some way in which people relate to the body of the dead and gather in memorial service to that person, right? But even so, we're losing touch with how to actually feel safe enough to feel our feelings and go through together as a community a grief process, right? So I mean, culturally, there are lots of places where there's still lots of rites and rituals around it, but it is interesting to see that I think overall there is a trend where there's not as much of a space to do grieving together as family and community and address like the emotions involved in grief.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah,
I totally agree. I think constantly I'm noticing when I'm listening to what you're saying that the the extent of dealing with death, I mean, because this is like the closest connection to the grief issue, I think, um, um, is so apparent. So I was wondering while you were talking, did the sort of driving out death out of everyday life in except for art being depicted in art, right? Okay, be it from paintings uh, to, of course, the movies. Um, uh, it's not happening. It's almost not happening. People, like I said initially, don't really talk about it much. And then I was wondering, maybe it was a logical consequence. I mean, of course, if you're kind of eliminating, in a sense, the cause for grief, you probably will lose the technique, the cultural equivalent of the biological incident
mm-hmm,
to deal with it.
mm-hmm,
And because, of course, if you're not talking about death,
mm-hmm,
you I mean, or the other way around, if you don't want to talk about death, you also don't want to talk about grief, because if you talked about the grief, death
yeah,
comes in through the back door again. So,
yeah,
and then you're like, okay, I actually
yeah,
didn't want to didn't want to deal with it,
yeah.
and here it is again. So
Yeah, I mean, I think this also has to do with um, societies, more societies that end up having greater privilege around curating a life where you get to uh, avoid dealing with the messiness of being alive. Like there's more structure or there's more of an infrastructure that people exist within in their society, where there's more convenience, there's better healthcare, socialized
yeah,
healthcare, where I think there's more ways that we can avoid decay or seeing signals of decay.
Yeah.
And we can kind of insulate ourselves from observing death. Um, I see that with a lot more privileged societies, whereas like living here in Mexico, I was very struck. The first year I lived in Mexico, I lived in Chiapas. And that is the most poverty-stricken part of Mexico.
Mm,
And to observe how common death was in the community. And I was, for multiple reasons, pretty um, strongly connected to the Mexican community where I was living, to see how normalized it was. Like, it felt like almost every couple weeks there was a death happening, and kind of like a tragic death too. Like, people were
mm,
dying these like tragic deaths that could be prevented, right? Or deaths that had to do with poverty, deaths that had to do with drug and alcohol use, murder, you know, really horrible things.
mhm,
And to see the community come together and have a procession down the street, and they would organize very quickly to do these processions, and the community would stop and pay their respects as the body went through. And there was music, there's a whole band, everything. And then the process of having a wake or a memorial or a funeral service, I forget what they call it in Spanish. Um, doesn't matter at this moment.
yeah.
But to see how many people show up to pay their respects and are crying and are there and are holding each other and sharing stories, and there does seem to be more of a connection to this topic of death here.
Mhm,
And then you also see like the holiday of Dia de los Muertos. And,
mhm,
it's this whole process around connecting to those who've
yeah.
passed on, and celebrating and grieving and celebrating combined. I mean, celebrating can be a part of grief too in this context.
Mhm,
But, they have a lot of different rites and rituals that are still intact around how to experience grief. And there's there's a way people are not insulated from the topic of death,
mhm,
because they can't it's not this society isn't as tightly controlled based on organization and its infrastructure,
mhm,
and its people are not necessarily protected from death the way that they
mhm,
might be um
mhm.
in
Yeah, I understand.
yeah, so
Interesting point.
it's yeah.
Yeah,
But still, though, even here I see
yeah.
ways that, like, maybe our tendency as humans, because it is so uncomfortable, and we are all on a global scale being introduced, like, there's a globalization, there's a, like, this gets into colonialism and like globalization and social media and the internet
Yeah.
and all this stuff, that um there is a way, I think, people are getting used to sidestepping just being with death anxiety, or being with the emotional core of what it is to
Mm,
face death and grief, right? And I think you spoke of this earlier with what was it, I think you said you wrote a note down about it, what was it, the compulsive use of media to
yeah,
avoid death
yeah,
or avoid the
yeah,
feelings about death.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, like as a
Yeah.
numbing system.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
We're all numbing collectively a lot more, and have access to some very powerful tools for numbing.
yeah, yeah. Um, okay, then I will say it now because I was putting this down also as a note, that it could also be the opposite. Because, for example, I noticed that
Hmm.
it works for me pretty much when I watch a movie that usually has some certain scenes with some quality. It literally moves me to tears, and I always sense that um, yeah, this is a grieving process going on
Hmm.
there. It comes in very different forms than you might think of, because it's not when somebody dies. It's usually when somebody gains his or her freedom in a movie.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
or autonomy, for example, because that's what being robbed of me,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, when I
Yeah.
think back, and that's and this longing for being free from the responsibilities and being yourself and kind of arriving at your own center of personality and stuff. This
Mm-hmm.
is what really touches me, and it
Mm-hmm.
definitely has a grieving aspect because it always comes along with the understanding that's what not happened to me. Um,
Yeah.
so so I mean, you could say like, okay, all these Hollywood studios are just like they're numbing us to death, amused to death. I mean, you've
Numbing
probably
us
heard
to
about
death.
this, heard about this,
Sorry.
yeah, or this. I mean, yeah, okay. Roger Waters kind of put himself into the offside a lot through his actions recently, but I think
Mm-hmm.
his album "Amused to Death" still has something to it. It's like
Mm-hmm.
overflow of
Mm-hmm.
consumption in the end.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it can also have the opposite effect, and it can be a means to go into the emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And now speaking about the emotions in general terms, I thought when you were talking about, okay, there's basically you were talking about the quantitative factor of being confronted with death, and for that matter, being confronted with the grief issue. And
Mm-hmm.
I can totally see this aspect in the whole context. Uh, Yet at the same time, I was wondering. Um, what you said would basically count for what we call the Western world, the developed world, because they like the best healthcare systems,
Mm-hmm.
not as many traffic deaths anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's There's a tremendously reduction of child death, for example, while giving birth over the 150 years, like tremendously going down in the developed countries. Children don't drown as often because they learn swimming, stuff like this. This
Yeah,
all
like
goes along.
education.
Exactly. Education
Mm-hmm.
goes all along with reducing death rates and, of course,
Yeah.
also increasing what's the
Lifespan.
age lifespan. Exactly. Okay. Now there's another thing I thought about, and it's funny. I'm I'm coming to this back in so many discussions and every time, and this is again the World War II trauma thing.
Mm.
Because, okay, let's say there is this entire cultural, technological, scientific gain and level that we all got to, so we can avoid a lot of deaths that would have just happened earlier. If you had an inflammation at one point, you would usually die when you had an open wound because you would just die. Period.
Mm-hmm.
Let the medic the doctors talk about what this is actually all about when the bloods get infected and stuff like this. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're having but coincidentally, most of those countries we're talking about were those who had been hit by World War II the most also.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So in
Mm-hmm.
other words, in Germany, I mean, that's my argument now here. Maybe the fact that we have not grieved properly and worked through the trauma of World War II
Yeah.
makes us more likely to go down the path of compensating and avoiding the issue because we do not want to go into those feelings. And
Yeah.
those feelings is actually not correct. I should say feelings in general, because if you go into some feelings, the whole realm opens up and all of a sudden, oh, there's also grief.
Yeah. All
But if
roads lead to grief.
exactly, or all feelings lead to every feeling leads to all feelings.
Yep.
So in other words, if you're having a country like Germany who definitely has not worked through its collective trauma. So now this is now the collective grief issue that you touched briefly before that earlier. I'm just wondering, on top of or that's actually the other way around. On top of the of what I'm talking now is the cultural, is the scientific and material gains and development aspect, but underneath a very elaborate need for avoidance, because if we had gone there, we would have also worked through the trauma issue. And
Mm-hmm.
since we didn't, of course,
Mm-hmm.
grief is not on the table as well.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I think a lot of people have this abstract idea about what trauma is. They're like, oh yeah, I'm traumatized. I've got trauma. And it's like, I think a lot of folks don't realize that part of trauma work is addressing grief, and part of grief is addressing trauma. Like they're very distinctly linked. Um, and I've had a lot of folks who they can't get into working with their trauma because they cannot acknowledge what they did not experience. That was like what they cannot acknowledge the experiences they missed out on. They cannot fully acknowledge what's happened to them and the losses that were there.
Ah,
You
okay.
know, so it's like, oh, well, yeah, my parents weren't ever really there for me. I was a latchkey kid.
Yeah.
And they might get that far, but they're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, but I'm fine. Like, look at me. Like I've adjusted well.
Yeah.
I've
And
become
then they
very
laugh.
independent. Yeah, ha ha ha. They might tell a story.
Yeah.
I've become very independent. I've become very self-sufficient. How great is that? And
Mm,
you can't really do deeper trauma work unless you go, I was a latchkey kid. Whoa. Like,
mm,
I feel so sad and upset, and I'm able to locate the despair I've got, or the futility or the hopelessness of repeatedly being left alone to tend to my own big feelings as a child, or to deal
mm,
with situations that as a child I shouldn't have been dealing with on my own,
mm.
and caretaking others when I should have been caretaken. And yes, I developed these skills of self-sufficiency and independence, but at the same time, oh my goodness, I have such a strong terror of trusting other people, or I have so much fear around failure, or I get so deeply overwhelmed in these certain contexts because of these losses, because of the things I never got.
Yeah.
Right? So it's amazing how their trauma and grief are so deeply intertwined. You have to be able to acknowledge
Yeah.
the feelings behind what experiences you never got to have, or the losses you had as a part of certain experiences.
I just recently experienced a person like this. I talked to an 70 something person, and he was talking about him growing up essentially with his grandmother, because the parents put him there in order to pursue their work in another city.
Yeah,
Um, and then the story went on a little bit like this, that he um, later got a brother, and then when he was already, like, I think in his teens or something, his parents then came back, and he was like, I didn't need them. I had everything." And I was like, what? Because my grandmother, she was taking care of me, and I had no connection to my parents, so I didn't need them. And I thought, this is a really very weird way to talk about that. You basically were robbed of the being close to your parents, and being educated and brought up by them.
yeah, you never
Because
got to be a child.
at least not under the auspices of your parents.
Yeah,
I mean, and I believe that the generational gap always plays a role. If you're
yeah,
being brought up by your grandparents, I mean, I'm not saying that it must be different, but I'm having a hard time. Um, I can hardly think about it as being totally the same or not relevant.
yeah,
That's basically my point. And then there was this occasion when this person was talking, and there was this occasional laugh, and I thought, like, okay, here's the compensation. That's the compensation. Now he's compensating. Now he's like diverting from his feelings.
yeah,
And I thought, what a sad story. And I
yeah,
didn't tell him like this, because I thought, yeah, let him talk. I
yeah,
mean, that's his understanding.
yeah,
And and I know a little bit about this person, and
yeah,
definitely. extreme obsessive compulsive disorder, extreme. This
Yeah,
person literally leans against the house door after it's been locked twice. He leans against it a couple of times to check if it's closed, and it's
yeah,
still not calming him, right?
yeah,
So stuff like this, so in other words, there's something that I would put into the department of insecurity, whatever you want to call it. But there's definitely some symptoms there.
yes,
And that goes further, but this is another issue. And I
yeah,
was just thinking, interesting that this thing is, and this is a very educated man, very
yeah,
highly educated man, and
totally.
no strength, let's put it like this, no strength to look into it and
Yeah,
face what actually happened.
yeah. I mean, when we are faced with traumatic experiences, most of us build pretty elaborate defenses. So you're talking about defense mechanisms, right? Like
Mm,
denial, intellectualization. These are defenses. And defenses are there to help us feel safe to relate with the world, a world that is consistently unpredictable, where we face vulnerability and inadequacy all the time. So it's like, you know, defense defenses or defense mechanisms also uh, can come out in certain ways based on different psychological disorders too, right? Like
yeah.
it's, you look at all the different ways. I mean, my own way of looking at the DSM is like it's all the different ways trauma kind of manifests itself in like a really focused set of symptoms. And we look at obsessive compulsive disorder, and that is literally just a way for somebody's deeply dysregulated nervous system from the trauma they've experienced and not having learned tools to better regulate themselves. It's a way they've learned how to regulate or try to approach
Mm,
self-regulation, which is through all this compensation, like you're talking about, or the defenses that are a part of that, like denial, right? Oh, yeah, it's
mm,
fine. Ha ha ha.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
yet on a fundamental level, it, we all adapt and believe that we're so normal in the ways we've learned to compensate for grief and unresolved grief and trauma. You know, where for him, leaning on the door is completely fine and normal, and his defenses help him cover over the fact that he's truly not okay.
Mm, yeah.
Like a way that we all uh, engage in delusion together. And I mean, collectively, we're pretty delusional in our different societies about like the fact that we're not okay.
Mm,
But
yeah.
you know, we do it through collective intellectualizing or um, you know, getting into an extreme level of denial about
Mm,
things that we've all gone through that have not been okay for us in our society or culture, right? And
mm,
the true impact of the grief in those experiences,
yeah.
right?
And now that you're bringing up the culture and denial, uh, I would say that the decline of institutions like what we used to have here in Germany a lot in until the 1800s, 19th century was like the grieving year. That's what it would be like the literal translation. I researched it earlier and then I didn't know that it goes back actually to the Roman, to the
Mm,
ancient Rome. That
mhm.
where it dates back to, and it also had some legal implications. For example, that women were not allowed to marry for a year.
Mhm.
Mostly, it's basically the women again who get all the rap. But
Patriarchy.
uh, pardon me,
Patriarchy.
no surprise. Yeah, no surprise. So she was not allowed to marry for a year, for example, and also you were
Mm,
not allowed to attend social gatherings, parties, stuff like
mm,
this.
mhm.
And on the other hand, in Germany, there was also a law that um, allowed women from husbands who were serving in official positions that
Mhm.
she was entitled to get the earnings for another year or another 10 months, for
Mhm.
example.
Mhm.
But this has all is all gone now, as far as I know, and this is part of the decline. And now, speaking of being confronted with. So, for example, if you, not example, I mean, this is what we're talking about. If you had this grieving gear, it also implied that you were supposed to wear black. For the women and the men were supposed to wear an armband, the Trauerflor, that's the German term for it. So it was basically a black armband. And now this is nothing else than forcing you into the state of awareness,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I look at this, or I looked at this from a very positive perspective when I thought about the whole grieving thing, and then I noticed nobody's talking about it, and it's kind of not
Mhm.
there. Nobody can help me with it either when I was trying
Mhm.
to get a hold on it somehow.
Mhm.
Um, and then I came across these institutions, and I thought, I mean, I'm using the term institutions because that's what a sociologist would say. It's like an institutionalized cultural thing, so to say.
Mhm.
Um, and then I thought it used to be looked down upon in terms of it's outdated, and we
Mhm.
not modern enough. We're not doing it anymore.
Mhm.
We're free from conservative kind of attitudes or whatever. That's
Mhm.
what a lot of people kind of argued
Mhm.
when they were saying like, yeah, why don't we have this anymore? But then I
Mhm.
thought, we also robbed ourselves from good things, and the good things are you are in the best sense of the term, I would say, forced to deal with it. And because first of all, you are supposed to wear black. Let's make it simple. You were supposed to wear black, dark clothes, and also, of course, your surroundings were could easily spot you as, oh, this woman is in grief.
Yeah.
And I can remember, I mean, I grew up like in the 80s, 90s in Germany, Western Germany, and I can remember my grandmother saying when we were wearing all black because it was cool in the 80s, she was like, "Ah, this looks like did somebody die?" Something like
Mhm.
this. Some comment came, so it was still there. She had it present as a
Mhm.
symbol. She could decipher this
Mhm.
symbol, this code of black clothes, what it actually
Mhm.
was supposed to mean or used to mean. And I
Yeah.
was like, yeah, I don't care. I don't really care. I mean, it's no wonder why the gothic and the black metal scene and everything, they have black as their color because that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Um, and so what we lost there was, first of all, the let's call it reassurance of the griever,
Yeah.
what's going on. That's number
Yeah.
one. But then
Mhm.
there's something else happening, and this is at the end of this year. I mean, of course, we can talk about how long does grief go and everything. I think we have it on our talking points somewhere also. Um, and I'm not saying that after a year your grief is over, but it also pre prevented you from falling into the deep hole of uh, grief depression. I mean, that's not a term I'm making up. But what I'm saying is,
Mhm.
once the year was over, you were supposed to sort of come back into societal life. And
Yeah.
that was also helping because, I mean, when you look at how therapeutic hospitals are, psychotherapeutic hospitals are working, it's all about structure.
Yeah.
It's like, now here's breakfast, this is lunch, then it's dinner, and this is your
Mhm.
schedule, blah 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 blah. And they,
Mhm.
they teach you need to get some structure because the structure also gives some hold to your inner
Mhm.
life, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so I was thinking, okay, so this is also lost because if you're now the guy who's going into the basement crying and never come out, nobody cares anymore
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's your freedom. I mean, again, I'm not against freedom, but you know what I'm saying. So it's actually a higher likeliness that people are getting lost in their grief process and nobody notices it because nobody is aware.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, we're also, it's interesting because we're not taught how to really hold space for another person going through grief, right?
Hmm.
Like these structures, I agree, can be so helpful in the immediate grieving process and then also helping people move on in life through with integrating losses, right? Like the fact that life goes on and I still need I've lost this person, or I'm grieving this thing, and I still need to work, or I still need to
Yeah,
like show up for other people.
yeah.
But it is amazing how even with these different structures, um, maybe we're relying a little too heavily on the structure itself and not how humans also need to infuse the structure with like care and compassion and concern and emotional availability to the person who's being held by the structure, right? Like it's again this we can go through all these different structures and go through the motions and not actually grieve if we don't have sympathetic or compassionate others or empathetic others, right?
Mm.
Who are there with us in a compassionate space, who are also, I think, I think we have a hard time holding space for others in grief if we've never held space for ourselves in grief, right? And it just gets passed down generationally. Right,
I
if
mean,
that
it's
wasn't something that was modeled to you or done for you, then how can you do it for others?
exactly. And this leads directly to the question, what can you do?
Mhm,
Because I noticed when I can't recall the specific incident, but I remember, as in general terms, when there was a death case in my in the vicinity of where I'm living, and or with friends or whatever, then I noticed that actually nobody knows what to do in terms of, I mean, with nobody, I mean the group of the acquaintances of the person who suffers the loss. Um, of course, this is another question now, what the person that suffers the loss can do. But I think we touched this already briefly by saying this is very individual in the first place. But
yeah,
very interesting was to me, and this is why I had this idea now, because he said nobody has experience with it, right?
yeah,
And so that also means if you're the one who's in the supporting role,
yeah.
you have no clue what you could do. And then at that time, I think that could also be at one time when I was in hospital. I'm not sure if I heard that from a therapist. Um,
Mm,
but I heard the line once that goes a little bit like this. The thing that you can always do is just be there. Just be there. And why I'm saying this so deliberately, it's because a lot of people come with solutions. Yeah,
yeah.
you should do this, should do sports, go, meet somebody, you need a new
Mhm,
boyfriend, I don't know what.
mhm,
But the interesting thing is, it's true. It is totally sufficient, and this is what a lot of people in the compensating world have a hard time with, is just be there. Because
mhm,
compensation also implies a lot of activity most of the
mhm,
time. You need to do something, be active. And and a lot of people have a hard time to just be there. And this
mm,
again, man, it's such a feeds again into the whole trauma thing. Why? Because
mhm,
if you're the person who's attending or supporting the grieving person, and you
mhm,
just need to be there, means
mhm,
you need to calm down also. And when you
mhm,
calm down by just being there, your emotions come up. And then if you cannot stand them, of course you're like, you better do this and do that, and come up with advices and so forth. So again,
mhm,
we're in the trauma as context, because if you're not able to calm down yourself, of course you cannot be a support to anybody else, because you have to deal with your feelings all of a sudden. And
oh
if
yeah,
you're not able to do it, then you're no good to any other person who deals with his or her feelings at that point.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's this topic of grief too. Like it does come back to like this huge existential level, right? So it's hard for us to deal with our feelings when they feel so big. They relate to a topic that's so big.
Mm,
And additionally, grief relates to like our vulnerability around not having control or power. Like there's something here around powerlessness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with trauma, it's the same thing, right? They're very intertwined. And I feel like it's when we talk about the structures that are in societies to help us grieve, I think there's also this attachment we develop to these structures of doing, and
Mm.
even these structures as a way of being, where there's a certain time limit, like you said, you know, a year, and then you move on. And the thing about grief is it's like this ongoing process that for each individual takes its own time. And it's really hard for us as humans to not get completely overwhelmed and feel completely inadequate to hold space for somebody that does not seem to be moving through grief the way that we think they should, or the way it
Yeah.
feels comfortable for us. And even individually, like I know for myself in my own life, for instance, breakups, those are really common experiences of grief for people.
Yeah.
And I used to be so hard on myself for the fact that it would take me way longer in my mind, and comparing myself with other people, it would take me way, way longer to get over a breakup, even if it was with somebody that I wasn't with for that long.
Mm.
And really, it's moving through grief, being able to deal with the feelings there, being able to depend on different people in my community or different structures to help me with that grief too. But ultimately speaking, most people get to a point where they're like, move on already,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
okay,
And
this
why
happened a
and why
few months ago.
and why do and why do they say that? Why do
Yeah.
they say that?
Because it's overwhelming to be like, whoa, this is so much bigger, or this is kind of this amorphous collection of emotion where, you know, we feel inadequate or out of control or powerless being there with you in it because it reminds us of our own powerlessness. And the fragility of all of our lives, right? Like that something like a breakup can be that destabilizing,
Yeah,
and we're
but
all
I mean,
susceptible to it, or, you know.
but the others are saying it, aren't they saying it because they can't stand it actually? They can't stand it anymore
Yeah,
that the
totally.
yeah.
You know, it's amazing though that we all put this time limit or these frames on how grief should look and the process it should go through. And even a time limit on how much we're willing to be present with somebody who's in
Mm,
grief,
yeah.
right? And we all have this like critical place we get to where we're like, oh, I can't be in this anymore.
Yeah,
And because
sure.
it really taps us into this like um experience of being very small and powerless and vulnerable and fragile, you know, uh and how each human life is actually really delicate.
So does it ever go away then? I mean, speaking of time limits, is there a time frame? Is there a limit? Is there the ultimate then it's done?
I mean, I've not lost my parents yet, so I can't say I can even comment on that. I've known a lot of people who've lost their parents, and they've talked with me about that process, and I've helped them with grieving.
Mm,
I can say that grief, with even the stages of grief, right? The Kubler-Ross stages of grief. When people get to acceptance as a final stage,
mm,
it's not to say that it stops hurting or it can't be triggering at different times, like that trauma of the grief won't come up. Like I think people are fundamentally changed after every loss they go through, and it's about finding who you are now and integrating that reality, and
mm,
learning how to open your heart further in the midst of a loss or as a result of a loss,
mm,
and to not let that be the reason your life gets a lot smaller and you end up becoming even more self-protective, but to actually
mm,
open further, to gain deeper compassion, to gain deeper empathy, to
mm.
feel yourself even more connected with humanity, because loss is something that connects us all. So
Yeah.
I don't think grief actually ever completely ends. We can heal more of the trauma around it. We can learn how to work with the emotions around it. We can integrate it more into who we are as a person and our narrative of how we live on this planet. We can learn greater social-emotional skills based on the experiences we've had with grief. But then I think over time, the pain starts to subside in certain ways. But I think we're all marked with grief and loss. Like I don't think there's ever a way to return to the state you were in before that loss happened, or that those series of losses happened. But I don't think that's the point. Like
What do
I
you
think
mean?
that's human
What do
life.
you mean? It's not the point to get over it ultimately?
If we're trying to return to some imagined way of existing from before that loss, that's ridiculous. We can't.
Yeah. And why can't we?
Why can't we? Loss breaks us open, like all sorts of loss, right?
Well, I would, yeah.
I mean, it breaks us. We hit rock bottom. We maybe don't even know we're hitting rock bottom. Maybe there's like a collection of experiences need to happen before we hit that rock bottom. But I think it's human life involves loss. We don't ever get everything we need, and we can't control all elements of life. It's not even close. And depending on the environments we grow up in, there's going to be even more loss because we don't have access to power and control to prevent loss, right? And even looking at oppression, like people who are like, nobody gets to escape loss, even the people with the most power on this planet. They just don't. But we look at the scales here, like look at different layers of oppression that people go through. And there's whole layers of trauma and grief related to that experience of being oppressed too. Because wherever you don't have power and control, there will be loss. And again, like this idea of the most powerful people, they still go through loss. We all die. I mean, maybe one day that won't be true, but like we're all animals at the end of the day. We're living beings that cease to be alive anymore, who, because of the complexity of this planet and there being so many different things going on all the time, we cannot control everything in our environment, even if we throw a ton of money and power and status at it.
Yeah. Well, I have a very, very short answer to why the grief doesn't go away. And that is because, sorry, that's not a critique. It's not a critique.
Fine. Fine, Chris.
What?
Fine.
Usually I hear those comments that I just made. So I was just taking the chance now that I can say it once.
Go
No,
for it.
I'm kidding. My point is, I mean, it's actually theoretically very simple because since grief is closely connected to the loss issue, the grief can never go away because the loss will never go away. The loss will not be compensated.
Yeah.
You made like
Yes.
yeah, I mean, and now speaking from personal experience, although I wish that I had overcome all these griefs, I find also, yeah, it doesn't go away. The only thing that changes is your way, and maybe at best your ability in terms of that is getting better to deal with it.
Yeah.
So, and it's because, and now this brings me back to the theoretical and starting point, because you will always be, not always, but you every once in a while you'll be confronted with your loss.
Yes.
And be it that somebody talks about his or her mother, his or her father, what happened there, blah blah blah, and then you are forced to be reminded of, yeah, that's what I don't have anymore or haven't had, and so forth. And for that matter, it's always there. And then at the very point you are in the grief again,
Yeah,
because you need to like deal with it, that there's this loss that you've just been reminded of.
yeah,
And there you go. So, and unless people stop talking to you, I mean, of course, metaphorically speaking, you will always be reminded of your
yes,
losses
yeah.
in one way or another.
Life always reminds us. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or a same situation gets replicated, right? Like it's,
yeah, exactly. And
I
so
want to
from that,
read, I want to share a poem that I think relates to this.
yeah,
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. Do you
this is
have more
cool.
to say?
No,
Okay.
no, go ahead.
Um, so when I was looking at different things about grief, I found this poem and I was like, oh gosh, this really hits me. And it's called Separation by W.S. Merwin, I think is how you say the name of this author, this poet. And it goes like this. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah. This experience of the loss never goes away, whether it be somebody's died or we've had a breakup or what have you, it's people get in or people, we can live life with a loss of somebody or the experience of holding on to someone or something. And that goes with us through whatever we're doing in life afterwards.
hmm.
And it's just there. It doesn't it doesn't
Yeah,
go away. And we get reminded of it too.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it leaves its marks, so to say,
Yeah.
or its
Yeah.
threads. And and by talking about these different kind of losses, I would like to add another quality of loss, because there was something that I had to experience, which I think made it more difficult for me to understand what am I actually grieving about.
Yeah.
And this is making a difference between hard losses and what I would then call soft losses. I mean, it's probably not a good um, phrase or wording, but for the lack of a better term. And that is when my mother became essentially paranoid schizophrenic.
Mhm.
Um, and then later on in therapy, I noticed, well, from a certain perspective, and that is from how she could fulfill her motherly role, I lost her at that point.
Yeah.
Now, the mind-boggling or emotionally boggling thing here is that you lost somebody who's still there.
Yes.
She was still there, but she was no longer able to or capable to fulfill and act out her role.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the psychosis basically took her away.
Yeah.
And this is then a situation I was thinking of, like, this is probably something that everybody would have hard time to get, you know. So and this is one of the reasons why I'm usually saying, when I tell my story in like short versions, suicide of the father, 20 years mental illness of the mother, suicide of the mother, everybody's like, two suicides. And then I'm like, yeah, but frankly, the 20 years of the mental ill mother are having much more an impact than those suicides. Now, why
Mhm.
is this? Because the suicides are like hard losses. It's like fact, it's there, it's just
Yeah.
gone. End
Yeah.
of story, so to say. And
Mhm.
this is something that I would think your mind can grasp to some extent. I'm not saying
Yes.
that it's totally understandable that somebody's just like out of your life and everything,
Yeah.
but this is what the process of grief is all about, to understand it, at
Yeah.
least in those terms that
Mhm.
we're being given as human beings. I mean, understanding what is understanding such a thing. But it's
Mhm.
something that you can like pinpoint your finger on, like, okay, this is when this person was born, then I was born, then this person left, and I'm basically now here with all that's there. But if the person that you're relying on and that you still need as a kid is basically you can't reach her on verbal level, communicative level, because the
Mm-hmm.
psychosis just takes a hold of everything,
Mm-hmm.
disrupts everything, distorts everything,
Mm-hmm.
makes it impossible for this person to be in that role. So the role definition is actually what makes the person, not the
Mm-hmm.
physical body, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not no longer able to get what you want there, but you still see the person, then all of a sudden, I think it feeds into the dynamics of anger
Mm-hmm.
and rage because you
Mm-hmm.
want it. As a kid, you want it. You want your
Yeah.
mother, you want your parent, and she the F is not reacting properly, and then you just go ballistic because you don't know what else to do, right?
Yeah.
And then later on, I learned, yeah, was basically me just trying to cope with the fact that I lost her, but she was still there, which was basically two contradicting informations, right? Or
Totally.
situations.
I saw this a lot actually with people going through terminal illness as well as dementia and the reaction that their partner would have with them or their kids would have with them as
Mm,
well. And I know it's different because you're speaking from the position of, having been a kid and previously having your mother be available to you and then not, right?
mm,
But yeah, we're not addressing like when I hear soft loss, I'm hearing attachment, like
hmm
attachment loss, right? Where it's like an attachment environment in the relationship that either was never there in the first place that you become aware of, you're distinctly aware of all the time, or one that had a distinct shift, right? For you, where
hmm
she was there and then she was not. And how
And
deeply
also,
impactful it is to have that repeated experience
yeah,
of not there, not there, not there, not there
yeah,
versus done, right?
yeah, exactly. And when you're like making the guillotine move, it also implies that the actual okay, with exceptions, but usually people are dead like suddenly now, right? You get the phone call or it happens, or I mean, with suicides, even more so.
Yeah,
But with a mental illness that comes like creeping in and
yeah,
very, very slowly changing this person from one character to the other, so to say. I mean, in my case, in my mother's case, it was really that case because she had no good phases anymore. She was
hmm,
always totally full-blown psychosis all the time, 24/7 when it
hmm,
hit the maximum, right? So there was no like, okay, now you're in a good mood and your schizophrenia is kind of like whatever, not
hmm,
there. Can we discuss some things and then there
hmm,
was another blow coming up? No, it was just constantly there. And so how do you adapt to a situation like this? I mean, you can, of course, just go along and adapt all the way through, but it's not like, okay, it has changed and now I'm looking at it and then see what's the difference. No, you're gradually being sucked into it as well,
yeah,
making it even more difficult to deal with it
mhm,
because the challenge at the beginning, when she was just merely talking to somebody who wasn't in the room,
yeah,
until the end when she was trying to commit suicide and she was like constantly making noises at night and crying and stuff like this is totally different ball game,
oh
right?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, when we're in the experience of this, so many different losses happening together, right? Like
Yeah.
there are so many losses from the point of your mom's mental health starting to slide, right? And that gradual process, more and more and more and more loss. And we are as humans extremely adaptive, right? We just adjust to what's happening. And in those moments, it's maybe unsafe for us to fully acknowledge that there is loss happening, right? Like it's not safe to stop and sit in our feelings around the loss. It's more like we might have anger or rage bubble up or different feelings at times, but in those points, you were just in survival mode, trying to ensure that you could have as much relevance or connection with your mom as possible, or that you could care for her well-being, right? Is she
Mm.
someone that you're attached to? And proximity, you tried to maintain proximity. And I think a lot of us, with these soft losses that happen in these really subtle ways where the person is still there, but they're not there, or they stop, there's these ruptures, repeated ruptures, or repeated ways that were unseen or uncared for or abused. It's it isn't, it's almost like it isn't big enough in that moment with one isolating one of those circumstances, or just like a few of them, to fully acknowledge that there is such a deep emotional impact, that there is such deep grief. And it's after the whole collection of it and we've removed ourselves from that situation that we can finally at some point start to address the grief and loss that's there. Right. And for many of us, if we don't leave a circumstance like that, then maybe we never do address that. Right. And for some of us, we might just continue to repeat the same sorts of losses that we had in early attachment with other people. Right. And that's just the level we're at with it. We haven't resolved the grief or the trauma, or haven't even acknowledged that we have those soft losses. And we just keep replicating what is, the normal sense of loss that we had earlier on in life. It's like we talk about how we go after what we were shown in childhood is love. Well, we also go after what the loss that is predictable that was shown to us in childhood is love too. We just keep creating that.
So you mean that, what do you mean by that exactly?
For instance, if we had soft losses around someone being completely unable to empathize with us, that was a normal part of our attachment environment. Guess what? We're more likely to go toward people who have real issues with empathy in future.
Reliving it, so to say.
Yeah, because that's what we consider love. That's what we consider to be normal. That's what feels familiar and comfortable. We feel most empowered when we know what our role is and how to relate to somebody. And I mean, of course, we change and we grow, we heal, many of us. So at some point, we all end up having to address this. But I mean, not we all, some of us really don't. Right? We're kind of selecting for certain types of loss in the future too.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And then those people notice, do not notice for a long time what kind of vicious circle they're actually in.
Yeah. I mean, I know for myself, like I'm healing so much trauma from soft loss traumas and, grief from childhood still. And I look at partner selection for me in the ways that I've drawn in and gone after people who are emotionally unavailable, just the way that my parents were with me. And I'm like, here it is again. Oh my goodness. And of course, dealing with people who are emotionally unavailable, like there's an addictive component that could come up because of their behavioral inconsistency, and it can become there's like a reinforcement of needing to seek them based on when they do show up, they manage to actually really be present and give you what you need. You're wanting to recreate that with them. But at the same time, it's like, as of the way I've started to stop doing this as much is dealing with those soft losses, addressing that they were there for me, addressing the trauma, being with the grief, even being able to deal with the grief that comes up that gets triggered when I'm dating somebody who's emotionally unavailable. Being like, here it is again. Oh, there's the grief. So instead of trying to avoid it, I stick with, I'm present with it. And that cuts me off from being able, or not cuts me off, but it starts to detangle the process a bit for me. Like I don't have to go into this compulsive action to like keep trying to compensate for these feelings of loss by going toward them and going toward this person and trying to feel better, or doing some other reactive thing in order to feel better, which is also going to be destructive. And, over time, as I've healed more and more of the grief and the loss, it's not as it takes less time for me to recognize what's going on and to feel the feelings and to redirect my energy and my focus.
So, but when you're talking about healing the grief in those instances, this sounds to me a lot more like these kind of griefs might at least feel a lot more like they actually had gone away. Although, of course, the loss is, like I said, theoretically,
Mhm,
the gap of the loss can never be filled. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a loss.
mhm,
Um, but what we're now talking about is different qualities of losses, different qualities of
mhm.
grieving,
Yeah,
and for that matter, also probably different qualities and kinds of types of healing.
yeah. I mean, I think if we have a repeated loss over and over and over again, that is going to sit more deeply within us than one loss that is a soft loss, right? So, for instance, in the moment, there might be a rupture between a child and a caretaker where the caretaker goes into maybe loses their job and for a period of time is unavailable to the child. But
Mm,
that's, based on a certain short period of time, maybe, and then
mm,
things return back to the normal, right?
mm,
That loss is going to sit within me in a less complex way than a whole childhood of my caregiver not being able to be there for
mm,
me and not being well resourced enough to provide
mm,
me my attachment needs.
mm,
So the losses that stick around on a deep emotional level and create a lot of our experience of the world and the patterns we recreate are those deeper losses that um, happened many over a period of time. I think the soft losses are the ones that do the most in terms of creating large scale patterns as well as defenses and stuff like this. Whereas losing, and I mean,
mm,
there's a caveat here, like we're saying soft losses are more attachment losses and like the big losses like losing someone to death, right? But if there's obviously if you're living in a place that's like a war zone, that's a that's major and that's going to have like way more of an impact on you than maybe these soft losses, right? So it's context based.
mm,
So it's not just we need to expand our definition of what soft losses and hard losses are, but
mm,
um if something overall, if we're being traumatized and it's over a long period of time where we're in extended dysregulation and overwhelm, and we lack the resources and the environment to feel safe to establish a default of safety or well-being, that's going to be the most difficult trauma to deal with, the most difficult set of losses.
mm,
Whereas if it's just one scenario every once in a while or one big
mm.
experience that you
Yeah.
then have to heal from.
Also because the soft ones are not as apparent to most people.
Yeah, soft ones, it's kind of like the metaphor of like putting a frog in water. It's a really horrible metaphor, but like the experience of us adapting or adjusting to
Yeah.
the water getting hotter and hotter
Yeah. Yeah.
until finally the the frog is boiled, right? Like we
Mm,
we know how to be quite adaptive as humans, for better or for worse.
mm. Yeah. Ooh.
I mean, we haven't even covered like the obvious form of, I guess, global loss, talking about COVID-19 pandemic, and
Yeah,
like
well, you can go into it. I mean,
there's
we still have time, I think, because we're just at it. I had to turn down my heater. Yeah, I mean that's I think that's a very interesting question when it comes to collective issues. I mean, we briefly touched it when it came to the collective trauma of World War II,
Yeah.
for example, and maybe it's even fair to have this allegory between hard and soft losses because World War II was probably pretty hard
Mhm.
in that sense. So,
Yeah.
while a pandemic, of course, there is also a huge number of casualties,
Yeah.
like literally bodies, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is also very interesting from the perspective that it seems to be also much more mind-boggling to a lot of people. I mean, all the
Mhm.
conspiracy stuff, all this like vaccine things. I mean, not that we need to
Mhm.
cover these things in depth, but of course, these are very good indicators how
Mhm.
people cope with it and
Mhm.
so forth. So that's I mean, the question would be, where does grief begin and end here?
Mhm.
And then where does uh, just normal adaptation processes begin, right?
Yeah.
Because apparently what you can definitely say from a sociological perspective, and of course also from a psychological, this was, I mean, I'm not saying this with irony or as a joke, but it definitely was God-given from a researcher's perspective because that all of a sudden instated a situation that could never be installed from a research uh, um, perspective in terms of I want to make an experiment.
Yeah.
What happens if a pandemic hits and nobody can leave the house?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
just like unheard of. So,
Mhm.
so a lot of theories can probably be tested with hindsight in terms of okay, what's happening when sociologically speaking, structures of orientation collapse.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, a lot of people got to experience what it's like when the infrastructure of their country doesn't, doesn't appear to have their best interests in mind. Or I say appear, right? Like everybody's got their own perceptual frame on it. But then there are also some countries where, like, blatantly so, the infrastructure did not come through for people, right? Like
Mm,
folks had no way to eat or make money, or
mm,
no proper medical care or access to medical care, or um, and then you've got the population, you got to see populations reacting in their own way to, like, it appearing like the infrastructure wasn't working, or appearing like life just stopped being normal, right? Like you didn't have the freedoms that you had, and all of a sudden, all these losses, like life would never be the same again. And not
mm.
knowing when it was going to go back to normal, or if it was even going to go back to normal. And I venture to say we're not going back to normal, right? Like it's, even if people are acting like we've gone back to normal, we are all changed from this.
Yeah,
And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to even watch. Like, I am fascinated by social media and seeing the trends on social media, outside of like conspiracy theories and people's ideas about COVID, where it came from, vaccines, all this stuff. Um, I'm interested in looking at how knowledge of trauma and the nervous system has totally blown up since 2020. I feel like on social media, there were not a lot of people prior to that talking about the nervous system. Like,
the nervous system in like neuroscience.
yeah, like the nervous system in terms of like um, understanding acute stress responses, trauma responses,
Hmm.
understanding vagal tone, understanding the vagus nerve, people getting into trauma being stored in the body, understanding stress responses, understanding cortisol. Like there's
Mm,
so much now that's out there with people talking about regulating the nervous system,
mm-hmm,
talking about trauma, understanding what trauma is. And
mm,
I do think that this is a positive to come out of an immense amount of traumatic loss that people went through in their lives changing, and then also watching people around them die, right? Or facing death, possible death themselves too, right? Or
mm.
the threat of death getting to you as well. Like being so distinctly aware of, oh my gosh, I could die from this. And not knowing if you can trust that the people around you are going to also protect you from death too.
And then we have all the people who then suffered from long COVID symptoms, and
Yeah,
they definitely have to grieve about a lot of losses in that
yeah,
department. Um,
yeah. I mean,
so the,
I suffered with long COVID. I got COVID in July 2020. It took me like a year and a half of feeling like I had chronic fatigue and
mm-hmm,
significantly changing my diet, my supplements, my lifestyle to be able to have some semblance of like finding normalcy again. And then finally, like about a year and a half in, all of a sudden, like my body improved tremendously. But I had no
mm,
idea. During that time, I grieved a lot. I was like, I'm never going to be back to where I was before. Like,
mm,
maybe I won't ever be able to do the things that I've loved doing, right?
mm,
And at this point, I'm almost 3.5 years out from when I first got, yeah, 3.5 years out from when I first got COVID. And I feel like I've just now gotten back to the level of conditioning and wellness in my body that I had prior to getting it. Right. And there's some
mm,
people I feel lucky. Like they're totally people that are changed forever.
mm,
They've got a disability now, or what you would
mm.
consider a disability.
Sure, sure. Okay, but coming back to the grief term, so I mean, you put up that talking point, and from the on the individual level, I mean, this is like manifold, to put it mildly. So it's like basically it's atomized in terms of what kind of changes and losses and people had to adapt to and grieve about.
Yeah.
Which one would you like pick out in terms of to depict or illustrate what you were thinking about when you put that down?
Mhm.
Because I'm afraid we will probably not cover all the possible instances that are out
Mhm.
there. And then,
Mhm.
of course, I mean, the way I introduced this, what I just said, of course, then there's the other side, which is the collective perspective. Like what happened on a collective level for an entire nation, for an entire society, for the entire world, in a sense, because this is like the would be the allegory to the World War II incident.
Yeah.
Something happened to a collective, and how, yeah, what's the impact there
Yeah.
from the grief perspective? So,
Mhm.
what would you want to focus
Well,
on the individual level? So,
so when I was just reviewing different literature out there from the past 5 years around grief, just curiosity about like what is important for researchers. Like how
mm,
are we engaging this topic of grief from a research perspective? I found so many articles about COVID and grief. And I mean, I didn't get to compare the articles around, other big global events and grief, but I would venture to say that I don't think there's been research like this ever, where we
probably
are
not. Yeah.
exploring grief on a global scale.
I mean, you
Um,
can definitely say that. Sorry if I interrupt you,
no,
but
yeah,
you can definitely say that from a history of science perspective, that I mean, a lot of the social sciences just got their heyday after World War II, and there
yeah,
was no pandemic after that
exactly.
that could have had the same attention from a scientific perspective.
Yeah. Um, what really has fascinated me is that there are even assessments or questionnaires being created to measure COVID grief,
Ah, okay.
which I think is fascinating. We're
Mm,
trying to learn to measure a specific type of grief experience, a specific type of traumatic grief.
mm,
Um, I see this as being quite positive in humanity being able to get very detailed in how we are understanding grief and how we're trying to measure traumatic grief experiences, and how we normalize the fact that as humans we have grief and it gets
mm,
carried with us through life, and it manifests as all these other things that we've been labeling as pathological, right? So
mm,
I do believe that, give it, I mean, I don't know, who knows about how many more pandemics we're going to have, right? Like that's another factor here too. Um, but I do believe that this experience could potentially help us humans start to be a lot more compassionate about grief, a lot more aware about grief,
mm,
um, begin to start having a larger conversation globally about how normal grief is, and help us start to understand the different emotions that come up with grief, which I think it could bring us all together, not just in individual cultures and societies, but on a global level. Like, how do we really um, support? How do governments start to support mental health better? And how do those governments participate with each other on a global level to support mental health and well-being? And mental health and well-being focusing on trauma and grief, right? And
That's
I
what you're
have
hoping, or that's
I'm
what you're seeing?
I'm hoping, but I think this has planted a seed, the experience of going through this together. And I think it will be a while before we get there. I think there are going to be a lot more losses that need to happen, but I think there's a new perspective that people are starting to take in understanding how loss deeply impacts us all, and
Okay.
how it generates, how it, when I say impacts, like how it forms our experience of reality
Yeah.
going forward.
Well, that's very optimistic.
I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I go into a dystopian place about this all the time too, but um,
I mean, I'm not saying that it should be like dystopic when there's a new pandemic. Let me just, for the sake of the excitement for the viewers, take the other perspective, because one of the main things that I think about when I think about the pandemic is that there seems to be a widely um, um, spread out inability of coping with radical changes in, yeah, what, like I said, sociologically, I would call structures of orientation.
yeah,
So that means, or in more colloquial terms, life was not the same all of a sudden. Lots of the infrastructure that you were, for example, used to use on a daily basis, like your supermarkets and your supermarkets were probably a certain thing, but they were hit at one point, at least when, for example, the supply chains weren't working anymore. But your pubs, mostly the entertainment industry suffered a lot and stuff. So all these things got taken away from people. You couldn't do indoor sports anymore. You couldn't do outdoor sports anymore in most of the places. And and so I think that conspiracy theories and groups who gathered around these kind of ideas, um, and now, of course, I don't want to go into it in detail, but they were definitely indicators of how difficult it was to understand the complexity of the changes that was just going on, so that it was easier for them to believe in reptiloid aliens.
Mhm.
I mean, it's easier to have a notion like this and accept it, which is so way out of left field, than going into the complexity of okay, yeah, that's what a virus is. That this thing is doing, and this is what it has, what it impacts, and this is why we're having these measurements and everything.
Mhm.
So I no, no, it's just over my head. That must be a world conspiracy thing here that's
Mhm.
going on, and that's yes, that's it. I can understand this. So there's a in other words, there's this theorem of there's a huge correlation between mental capability, cognitive capability, and the ability to adapt to these radical changes.
Mhm.
And the other thing that comes to it is when you were bringing because you were bringing up the government issue, I'm wondering if when there's a next pandemic, of course, ceteris paribus, given like everything would be the same except for the virus, but still the effects of the virus will be the same, because of course if the virus is like lethal as shit and you get it and you die, sure there will be extreme measurements probably, pretty sure.
Mhm.
But what I'm saying is, with hindsight, in Germany at least, the understanding is we went too far. We did too extreme measurements. We were too strict and so forth. A lot of my medical friends are like, yeah, this was just over the top. I mean, okay.
Mhm.
Anyway, my point being that maybe the reaction, the countermeasures, the awareness of, yeah, we should be dealing with grief and everything with a more delicate, from a more delicate perspective here. Might not happen because they're saying, "Oh, we can't go that far.
Mhm.
We have to dial it back a lot because people are people are not ready. There, you will not be able to communicate this right now. If there was another wave of COVID coming, just for the sake of the theory, it's very unlikely it's going to happen because the virus has mutated so much,
Mhm.
but as far as I understand. But my feeling, I mean, it's just like a gut feeling, is people would go on ballistic if they face similar
Mhm.
measurements.
Mhm. Well, I think we're actually in agreement with each other here that governments, societies and governments are more aware of how we experience grief or loss. Like there's
Mm,
that awareness there now where I think we will handle it more sensitively if there
mm,
is another pandemic. I
okay.
think that is an awareness there that I don't think was fully there in the way that different governments addressed the
Mm,
pandemic for COVID-19. But
mm,
I do think that there will be an awareness now of, oh, wow, we know how this impacts mental health to have loss like this. And,
mm-hmm,
we've even got measurements, like we've got research that looks at this. So if there's a way that we can prevent loss uh, in it
mm,
and maybe have support systems in place to help with the losses that are inherent because of the limits of our system,
mm,
um, I do, and I think there are some governments that legitimately will not care, right?
mm,
But I do also think there are governments that will.
mm,
And I do think that it's sort of a critical mass thing. Like the more governments are or societies have that in their awareness and are trying to
mm,
adjust according to anticipating how grief can happen for people and how people are influenced by it.
mm,
I do think that it will also create a large scale global change where certain governments will feel more pressure to start to pay more attention to that,
Yeah.
or certain governments will give aid toward specific policies or structures that will help in these governments that can't support themselves, right? Like
Yeah.
I think it'll be something that trickles into government, like policy creation. So
But let's make clear, I'm hearing you saying, or I hear that you were talking about actual physical loss, so deaths.
loss in lots of ways.
Okay, because then I would make a distinction
Hmm.
between the losses that are concerning infrastructure, consumption things, and so forth. And the interesting difference, and I think it's an important difference, is these losses are a different quality of losses because people are very much believing, and for good reason, that these things will come back. So these are not losses that are for good, right?
Well, I don't
Com
think that that's necessarily true.
Okay, because
I think depending on the country you live in.
I mean, for example, okay, sure, but let's say, sure, a lot of movie theaters died, bars died, and stuff, but we still have movie theaters and bars back, so to say. You know what I'm saying? So you can go to a bar again. It might not be the same, and from that perspective, you're okay. Here you're right. That bar is gone. True, true, true. Um,
But I get what you
and it,
mean, that we can
yeah,
depend on, there's a certain standard of living that is
yeah.
characteristic of each society, where after the pandemic, even if certain businesses closed down, there was sort of some of that same lifestyle stuff that continued again, right?
Actions that you're
Like,
being used to. Yeah,
yeah, like there's restaurants that you can still go to. There's,
yeah.
yeah.
So there, I mean, this is, I find this very important because I personally would react very differently to a situation where something is gone that I think, yeah, it'll be back. I don't know when, it'll be back. And now I have to adapt to the situation, and maybe I'm a little bit too hard on myself, or was too hard on myself by saying, yeah, I can live with the what's the word, um with being deprived from certain possibilities. I
Yeah.
can live with being limited in my life right now for a certain amount of time, which made me then think like, am I too used to just like adapt to being limited to doing things? Because
Mhm.
in the end, I felt maybe this is also some sort of a um, characteristics of people who have suffered certain losses. They're like, yeah, doesn't make a big difference if there's another one. Kind of like what's this word from this movie from Lars von Trier with Kirsten Dunst, when this meteor is coming and she's depressed, right? And she's like, yeah, well, so we die. I don't give a damn, and everybody else is just going really, really crazy while she's just adapting to the situation, to the inevitable,
Mm.
and like, yeah, okay, so then it happens.
Mhm.
While everybody else is desperately and of course futilely trying to escape the meteor, but there's no way to do it. Um,
Mhm.
and so I'm wondering if people who have already experienced grief um, might look into a lot of things a lot more relaxed than people who haven't.
Um, Probably. I mean, I'm trying to think of the term. There's a term here. What's this term? Maybe we can just show it on the screen. But
Yeah.
there's this way that people become accustomed to loss and to um, learned helplessness. I think that's what it is. And
Mhm.
there's that's a tricky term because it can be very victim blamey in a way, and how people use that. But really learned helplessness came out of clinicians observing people who've been through a lot of loss and trauma, and them being like in a state of futility, like, okay, there's nothing I can do about it, or I'm not gonna do anything about this, or this sense of powerlessness, or even apathy, or it's even described as this sense of perpetually feeling desperate or dependent on the help of other people.
Mm.
And I don't like this term learned helplessness, but this is what it makes me
It's
think of,
called. Yeah,
right?
okay.
And I look at it as like, from a nervous system perspective, when we've gone through a lot of traumatic loss, there is a way that, one, we can either have traumatic growth and form a sense of resilience and more mental flexibility in acceptance of the fact that loss is normal. But we can also
Mm.
go in the direction of there being kind of like this nihilistic or futile way of viewing the world, where we're caught in what you'd call being like a freeze response or a numbing response, a dissociative response, where
Mm-hmm.
we're maybe really cut off from the implications of what's happening, like the loss that's happening, because we've just gone
Yeah.
through so much that this is the way that we cope, not feeling. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say what was actually going on for that character in the movie, but I think we come up with the best way to react to traumatic situations. And if we've been through enough that are the same with this loss, many of us do go into a place of like shutting down, or
Mm.
just having this sense of futility or apathy. We dissociate. We can
So
go
is
into
this,
this fog, right? Like
yeah,
but that's just how you survive what feels completely overwhelming and intense. Like if
exactly.
you've
And
gone through it enough, it's not intense anymore.
yeah, right. And is this state of how did you call it?
Learned
Um
helplessness.
no,
It-
no, the dissociation.
Yeah.
Is this could this be like the ramp of when you're taking the wrong turn that you then might end up in a psychosis?
Yeah. I mean, most of us are pretty fragile. Like if we've got enough trauma and we have
Mm,
enough really big losses that hit us, it doesn't take that much for us to head in a direction like that. Like a
mm,
lot of us think like, oh, I could never have a psychotic break. And it's like, oh, really? You
mm.
think you can't? Okay.
Well, yeah,
But I mean,
and
honestly, yes, that is a direction that people go in if they have enough loss
yeah.
and they lack the internal resources and the external resources.
Yeah.
And you know,
So,
it's
so that does it make sense? And then at that point, that okay, I cannot take the grief, I cannot take the loss. I divert from that coping path, or from that working through path in the end, because the grieving path is actually working through. It's, of course, it's also part of coping. But then you can say, if I cannot go there, then I go the other way, and then the question is, either I become psychotic, or or I have a total breakdown, or I choose some really weird theories that make me just feel better because that's what I can grasp.
Mhm. We are all capable of entering some really distorted
Mm,
spaces of reality, collectively and individually, if
mm,
we have just the right amount of stress and a lack of resources to deal with that stress.
mm,
And that's internal resources like skills for working with emotion, a framework for knowing how to do it, or externally in the community around us, or not having community, being totally isolated. And then you bring
yeah,
in things like uh, genetic predisposition to things,
yeah,
the use of different substances, diet and exercise, like all these different factors that play a part in whether somebody just goes over the edge to a
Yeah.
realm that's like really far out there.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, grief is, ooh, it pushes us into some really extreme spaces. And I
I
mean, that's
mean,
again, that's
yeah.
part of why I'm excited about the research being done on the impact from the grief with COVID, right? Because
Yeah.
it's finally helping us put more context to the fact that like grief and traumatic loss is such an inherent part of human life, and we need to learn how to work with it,
Yeah.
and not just work with it individually, but like within community, culturally, societally, globally, right?
Yeah, and this is what the pandemic definitely has done. It has shown us how vulnerable and unstable a lot of people are,
Yeah,
and how fragile the situation of alleged apparently stability is.
yeah.
So, I mean, so many people fell for shit
Yeah. Well,
because it
that's the
was just,
thing. Well, sorry.
yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing too. It's like we can't keep approaching this like, oh, well, here are those of us who stayed connected to reality and those of us who didn't. We need to look at the fact that there were enough people that lost the capacity to function that are still struggling to function, that we
Mm,
need to address creating skills for how we work with grief and trauma. Like we have to come together to do this. We can't just be like, oh, well, that's the collection of the population that we're just going to disregard. It's like, no, we're all in this together. Like if half of society is not functioning for whatever
mm,
reason due to grief, that means society is not functioning.
mm,
And look at the
mm.
long-term impact of that. Like you cannot have a positive, well, I don't know, I can't predict the future in this way, but I would think you can't have a positive trajectory of growth for a society if half the people in society are not well, right? And I think we're hitting that critical point where like
Yeah.
we have to look at this. I know
Mm,
in the US it's like there's so many ways we are not looking at it, right? But I think in a lot of societies there's so many ways we are not looking at grief and trauma,
mm,
right? And it's we cannot afford to go into another pandemic and not tend to that and do some preventative stuff or uh, have some ways that we're tending to how to work together with grief. Because
yeah.
I mean, it really is like, I'm a little concerned about what, if we don't do that, what will happen with the next pandemic.
Oh,
I
that's
think
for
it's in the
certain.
best interest of
Yeah.
society and us globally to look at that.
Yeah.
I would hope, given what I'm seeing with research, that that's the direction we're heading in, right?
Well, I definitely agree with you that there's the need for this, and I of yeah, I would say the research is there, but that doesn't mean that it has a political impact. I mean, hello, look at climate change. The research is there.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I think yeah, because before
I
we
love
before
that
we
you lead
open,
in. The research is there. It's so true.
yeah, I mean, I just heard another. This is like a very famous German scientist. He's like on television all the time, and he just elaborated a couple of months ago that we know this like since the 70s. We know it since the 70s. Research started way earlier, but we know it since the 70s, and now we're 50 years later, no general acceptance. So, in other words, your words in God's universe, whatever entity's ear, that it's gonna happen, and I couldn't agree more that it's supposed to be happening. Um, Yet, I'm also a little bit more skeptical when it comes to this. But
Mhm.
I think this is a yeah, I would just say like a nice ending
Yeah.
of our session today, because we started with what is the need for grief, and we're back at it. What need for grief and awareness for grief we need to have, and
Mhm.
how much we're lacking it,
Yeah.
and we're still hoping that it's happening. And
Yeah.
so yeah,
And
I
I mean,
think
I feel like we we could talk for like 20 more hours about this topic and like nuances and the specific
Yeah.
things that we brought up. But we covered a lot.
Yeah, we definitely did, and especially when it comes to the ways how to grieve, that could be a lot of hours because it's
Mhm.
individual,
Yeah.
and it would be interesting to see if there where are some matching aspects of grieving when it comes to different forms of grieving and so forth.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I think it's
It's a
probably
big
sufficient
topic.
for today. It's a big topic.
Yeah.
So so since you made the introduction, I take the liberty to say goodbye and wrap it all up. And next time it will be without black fingernails if when the daughter or the sister of my godchild does not have her way. And
No,
and
it was fitting though. We're talking about death and you got into
yeah,
goth.
that's
So that
true.
was like, ooh, you painted your
See,
nails for this.
my subconscious told me don't take it off. It's also looks a little bit rotten of already because it's like 10 days old or whatever. Yeah, maybe I have to
Decay,
renew it.
death and decay.
Decay, death and decay, and I'm grieving about my black fingernails. All right, so that's it for today.
Okay.
Thanks for watching, participating, listening, and
Mhm.
I hope we'll be back soon with a new issue. And see you next time. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
No time.